When Margaret Lawson's son abandoned her after surgery, he thought she was just an old woman with a small house and a stack of medical bills. 14 months later, he sat in an attorney's office, hands shaking, face pale, and discovered she had been worth millions. And he had already lost almost all of it. But the money wasn't what destroyed him that afternoon. What destroyed him was a photograph. And 4 sentences his dead father had written, 24 years earlier, that proved someone had seen exactly who Beckett would become, long before Beckett did. This is that story. Margaret Lawson had a habit of keeping things to herself. Not because she was secretive by nature, but because she had spent 43 years learning that the people who loved you most were also the people most capable of hurting you if they knew exactly what you had. So she kept quiet. About the money. About the letters from her uncle's attorney. About the account sitting in a bank in Portland that had been growing quietly for 11 years, like something alive and patient, waiting for the right moment to matter. She kept quiet, worked her bookkeeping job, drove her 10-year-old Civic, and clipped grocery coupons on Sunday mornings, the same way she always had. And she loved her son. That was the part nobody would ever fully understand later. Margaret loved Beckett with the kind of love that doesn't keep score. The kind that gives and genuinely forgets to ask for anything back. After his father died when Beckett was 19, Margaret became both parents at once. She picked up extra clients. She skipped vacations. She sent money she couldn't spare every single time he called asking for it, which was more often than she ever admitted to anyone. She told herself that was just what mothers did. She was wrong about that. But she wouldn't find out for a while yet. The accident happened on a Tuesday in November. Margaret was driving home from a client's office in the rain when a truck ran a red light on Henderson Avenue and hit the driver's side of her Civic, hard enough to push the car sideways into the median. She remembered the sound. The way the world tilted without warning. The strange, total silence that followed. She woke up in Mercy General with a fractured pelvis, 2 broken ribs, and a dislocated shoulder the surgeon later described as severe enough to require full reconstruction. The first thing she asked the nurse was whether anyone had called her son. The nurse said yes. Margaret spent the next 4 hours waiting for Beckett to walk through the door. He never did. What arrived instead was a text message at 7:14 in the evening. Mom. Just heard. Glad you're okay. Crazy week here. I'll call tomorrow. She read it 3 times. Then she set the phone face down on the hospital blanket and stared at the ceiling tiles until a nurse came in to check her for. The nurse's name was Tessa Monroe. She was maybe 35, with dark circles under her eyes and the particular kind of calm that only develops in people who have stood beside enough suffering to stop being rattled by it. She checked Margaret's vitals without rushing. She adjusted the pillow behind Margaret's shattered shoulder with a gentleness that felt deliberate, not automatic, not procedural. Deliberate. She noticed the phone, face down on the blanket. She didn't ask about it. Instead, she said quietly, "Can I get you anything before the night shift comes on?" Margaret looked at her. My son was supposed to come. Tessa Monroe didn't offer false comfort. She didn't say he was probably on his way. She didn't fill the silence with optimistic noise, the way people do when they don't know what else to do. She just said, "I'll be back to check on you in an hour." It was such a small thing. But Margaret would remember it for a long time afterward. On the 3rd day, they moved Margaret into a room at the end of the hall. The room across from hers, she could see it clearly through her open door, belonged to a woman named Gloria. Margaret learned the name from the nurses. She never actually met Gloria. She didn't need to. Because Gloria's room told her everything. There were flowers on every surface. Balloons tied to the chair rail. A hand-painted banner, the kind children make with poster board and too much glitter, that read "We love you Grandma" in uneven, urgent letters. Every afternoon, without fail, the room across the hall filled with people. A husband who held Gloria's hand and didn't let go. Adult children who took turns sitting beside the bed. Grandchildren who climbed carefully onto the mattress and pressed their small faces against her shoulder. Margaret watched all of it from her doorway. Then she looked at her phone. Nothing from Beckett. Nothing from Sienna. No missed calls. No messages asking how she was sleeping, whether the pain had changed, whether she needed anything brought from home. Just the screen. Blank and bright and indifferent. She set it face down again. And she looked back across the hall, at Gloria laughing at something her grandson had said, at the balloons, at the glitter banner, and something inside her chest went so quiet it almost felt like peace. It wasn't peace. It was the specific silence of a woman who had just stopped expecting something she had been waiting for her entire life. Tessa found her awake at 2 in the morning on the 5th night. Not crying. Just awake, sitting up against the pillow, watching the dark rectangle of the window like it owed her something. Tessa came in quietly, checked the 4, and then, instead of leaving, pulled the chair closer and sat down. "You should sleep," she said softly. "I know," Margaret said. She didn't move. Tessa waited. She was good at waiting. She had the kind of patience that doesn't perform itself, the kind that simply exists, steady and unhurried, like something that was just always going to be there. "My son isn't coming," Margaret said finally. Not with anger. Not with self-pity. Just as a fact she was in the process of accepting. Tessa didn't contradict her. She didn't offer an explanation or a softening. She just said, "That must be very hard." "I keep thinking I did something wrong," Margaret said. "That if I had just," she stopped. "Mothers always think it's something they did." "Is it?" Margaret was quiet for a long time. "No," she said finally. "I don't think it is." She paused. "But knowing that doesn't seem to change how it feels." Tessa nodded slowly. "It rarely does." They sat together in the quiet, the two of them, in a hospital room at 2 in the morning, while the monitors beeped their soft, indifferent rhythm and the hallway outside moved with the low, purposeful activity of a world that didn't stop for grief. "What's your daughter's name?" Margaret asked eventually. "Wren," Tessa said. Margaret smiled, just slightly. "That's a beautiful name." "She chose it herself, more or less," Tessa said. "She was 4. She found a bird that had fallen from a nest in our backyard, and she carried it around for 3 days insisting it was going to be fine." Tessa paused. "It was fine, actually." "Stubborn child," Margaret said. "Extraordinarily," Tessa agreed. And for a few minutes, in that room, at that hour, something that was almost warmth moved through the cold. On the 5th day, Beckett finally called. Not to say he was coming. To explain, more thoroughly, why he couldn't. His voice had that quality Margaret now recognized, the one that meant he had rehearsed the conversation already. Probably with Sienna sitting across from him at the kitchen table, coaching him through the phrasing the way she coached everything that required a particular outcome. "The thing is, Mom, the Mercer account just landed and I genuinely cannot step away right now." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I need help when I'm discharged, Beckett. I can't walk unassisted yet. I can't cook. I can't manage the stairs alone." A pause. "What about home health services? Insurance probably covers something." She closed her eyes. "I was asking about you." Another pause. Longer. "Mom, I want to help, I do. But this timing is genuinely impossible." And there it was. The word that does the work of 100 cruelties without technically being cruel. Impossible. Not unwilling. Just unable. Just timing. Just circumstances entirely beyond his control that had nothing whatsoever to do with his choices. Margaret said she understood. She said it clearly and steadily. Then she ended the call and lay still in the silent room for a very long time. What happened next, Margaret never saw coming. 10 days into her stay, Tessa came in during a quiet afternoon, and she looked different. Not distressed, exactly. Controlled. The way people look when they've discovered something and are deciding how to say it. She sat down without speaking first. That alone told Margaret something was wrong. "I need to tell you something," Tessa said carefully. "And I want you to hear it before I tell you how I found out." Margaret waited. "A man called the nurse's station this morning asking about your condition. He said he was your son." Tessa paused. "He also asked to speak with your attending physician, specifically about your cognitive state." Margaret frowned. "My what?" "He asked whether you had shown any signs of confusion. Memory lapses. Whether you seemed, in his words, easily influenced by people around you." The room went very still. Margaret felt something cold move through her chest, not surprise, exactly, but the specific chill of watching something you feared become real in front of you. "He called the nurse's station," she repeated, slowly, quietly. "Yes. And from what I understand," Tessa hesitated, "your doctor received a similar call from a woman who identified herself as your daughter-in-law." "Sienna." Margaret looked toward the window. The parking lot below was full of ordinary afternoon activity, cars pulling in, visitors walking toward the entrance, a family unloading balloons from a trunk. Normal life, moving normally. While somewhere in Columbus, her son and his wife were quietly building a case that his mother couldn't think clearly. Before she could even heal. Before she could even walk. "They're trying to establish something," Margaret said quietly. Tessa looked at her steadily. "I think so." Margaret looked down at her hands and felt something harden inside her. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter than anger, and far more permanent. He hadn't waited for her to become vulnerable. He had started the moment he heard she was. She heard them before she saw them. 3 days before discharge, Margaret woke in the middle of the night, too warm, too restless, and carefully lowered herself toward the door to try the hallway light switch. She heard Beckett's voice first. Low, measured, the voice he used when he thought nobody important was listening. He was in the corridor, talking on his phone. She caught it in fragments, through the narrow gap of the door. But fragments, sometimes, are enough. If she stays in that house, it gets complicated. A pause while the other person spoke. "I know, but we can't wait forever, Sienna. If something else happens, we need to already be in position." Another pause. "The house alone is worth what?" That's before you even get to anything else she might have sitting around. He laughed, softly, briefly, at something Sienna said on the other end. "Exactly. So let's not overthink it. We just have to be patient a little longer." Margaret stood in the gap of the doorway and held herself perfectly still. She had loved this man since before he could walk. She had held him through every failure, every fear, every storm he hadn't known how to weather alone. She had given him pieces of herself she never got back, and she had done it gladly, without resentment, without keeping score, because that was what it meant to be his mother. And he was standing 10 feet away from her hospital room. Talking about the house. Talking about position. Talking about being patient a little longer. As if she were an investment he was waiting to mature. Margaret went back to bed. She didn't cry. She lay in the dark with her eyes open, and for the first time in her life, she let herself feel something she had always refused to feel about her own son. Betrayed. Not disappointed. Not heartbroken. Not confused. Betrayed. And then, slowly, quietly, like a door swinging open into a room she had kept locked for 11 years, she started making plans. Tessa drove Margaret home when she was discharged. She had insisted, in that quiet way she had, not pushy, just certain. The house on Clover Lane felt enormous in a way it hadn't before the accident. Too quiet. Too full of the particular loneliness that accumulates in rooms where 2 people used to live and now only one does. Delaney Price, her neighbor, appeared at the door within the hour, carrying a casserole and moving with a cane herself, which made Margaret feel simultaneously grateful and guilty. "Don't you dare apologize for needing food," Delaney said, before Margaret could open her mouth. "How did you know I was going to?" "Because you apologize for everything. Always have. Delaney set the casserole down and turned around. And we're going to work on that. Tessa came on Tuesdays and Fridays. She brought her daughter Wren on the Fridays, a small, serious girl who immediately announced that Margaret's house lacked something essential, and spent 3 weeks lobbying for a cat until a small grey creature named Button arrived and took over the best chair in the living room with imperial confidence. For the first time in years, quietly, almost without noticing, Margaret's house stopped feeling empty. Beckett arrived unannounced on a Thursday evening. He came alone. He always came alone when there was something he needed to accomplish. He sat in the living room, accepted coffee he didn't drink, spent the first 20 minutes talking about the children, about work, about a trip they were planning. He was charming when he chose to be. She had always loved that about him. It was harder now. She knew what he'd said in that corridor. She knew about the house. About position. About being patient a little longer. And she sat across from him, poured his coffee, asked about the children, and let him believe she didn't. Eventually he settled forward in his chair and said carefully, "I talked to someone at Meadow Glen again last week." "That's the assisted living facility," Margaret said pleasantly. "It's really exceptional, Mom. The medical staff alone, and the activity calendar is genuinely impressive. You'd have people around you. Community. I have people around me." Something moved across his face, quick, controlled, almost professional. "That nurse," he said. "Tessa," Margaret said. "Her name is Tessa." "Mom." He set down his coffee cup carefully, as though the motion itself required management. "I'm sure she's a kind person. But you just met her. You're in a vulnerable position right now. These situations, people take advantage. It happens more than you'd think." Margaret looked at her son. He was handsome the way his father had been handsome. Good jaw, easy confidence, the kind of face people trusted without knowing why. For most of his life, that face had looked at her with something warm behind it. Now it looked at her with something calculated. "You called my doctor while I was in the hospital," she said. The charm didn't vanish. It solidified into something harder, more deliberate. "I was concerned." "You called the nurse's station, too," she said evenly. "You asked about my cognitive state. You asked whether I seemed easily influenced." A beat of silence. Sienna thought it was important to understand the full picture. "Beckett." Her voice stayed level. That steadiness, she could see it in his eyes, unsettled him far more than anger would have. "I know what you were building toward. And I need you to hear me clearly when I tell you, it will not work." He leaned back. "Mom, you're reading into things." "I was on the floor of an operating room for 3 hours," she said quietly. "They put surgical hardware in my pelvis. My shoulder required full reconstruction. I woke up alone. I waited for hours for you to walk through that door." She paused, just long enough for it to land. "And while I was waiting, you were making phone calls about my mental competence." The room was completely still. Beckett exhaled, long, controlled. "I'm trying to be responsible. Somebody has to think practically." That word again. Practically. She added it to the list, alongside impossible, alongside timing, alongside all the other clean words people choose when they need their choices to sound like inevitabilities rather than decisions. "You should go home," Margaret said quietly. "Give Sienna my love." He looked at her for a long moment, like a man recalibrating. Then he picked up his coat and left. Margaret sat in the silent living room and did not cry. She called Holden Carter instead. Holden Carter's office smelled like old carpet and leather and coffee that had been sitting too long, the smell of a place where serious things got resolved without drama. Margaret brought the Portland documents to the appointment. She had never spread them out in front of another person before. Holden read through everything carefully and quietly. When he finished, he removed his glasses and looked at her. "Mrs. Lawson," he said. "Are you aware of the current valuation?" "I have some idea," she said. He said the number. She had known the number, the way you know something you've trained yourself not to think about directly. The way you know a room exists in a house you've never opened the door to. Hearing it spoken aloud felt different. The commercial properties have appreciated significantly, Holden said. The investment structures your uncle used were unusually well protected. Over 11 years, the total estate has grown considerably. Margaret looked at her hands. My son doesn't know. Holden studied her. May I ask why? Because I needed him to be my son, she said. Not my heir. Holden was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, I understand. He's already trying to have me declared mentally compromised, she said. He's discussing assisted living. His wife is involved. And from what I've heard directly, he's been moving faster than I realized. Holden folded his hands carefully. Who does your current will name? Beckett. Everything. A pause. Would you like to change that? Margaret looked at him across the desk. She thought about the text message. About impossible. About practically. About the phone calls to her doctor made while she was still barely conscious. She thought about a corridor at 2 in the morning and a voice she had loved her entire life talking about houses and position and patience. She thought about Tessa Monroe, showing up on a Saturday in her own clothes with real chicken soup and a daughter who wanted to find her a cat. She thought about the kind of person she still had time to become. She didn't answer yet. I need to think, she said. Holden nodded once. Of course. She picked up her coat. She thanked him. She left. And the audience, watching, was left to wonder. Did she change it? She wasn't saying. Not yet. What happened next arrived in a phone call from Holden, 3 weeks later, on a grey Wednesday afternoon. His voice was careful. Measured. The way it got when news required management. He had been reviewing Margaret's financial records in preparation for the estate documents. Standard procedure. Cross-referencing property holdings, account histories, tax records. He had found something. I need you to come in, he said. There's something you should see in person. She went the next morning. Holden had a folder open on his desk when she arrived. He didn't preamble. He slid it toward her and let her read. It took her a few minutes to understand what she was looking at. Then it took a few more minutes to accept it. Because what the document showed, cross-referenced against her own bank records, her own transaction histories, her own carefully logged years of quiet generosity, was this. Every significant amount of money Margaret had given Beckett over the past 11 years had gone, not into his business, not into his family security, not into any of the urgent purposes he had described at the time, but into the gap left by a series of catastrophic private investments and, behind that, a pattern of compulsive financial behavior that had been quietly consuming him for nearly a decade. The real estate losses. The failed partnerships. The years of borrowing against tomorrow to cover yesterday. And running beneath all of it, like a current nobody had named aloud, a gambling problem that had never fully stopped. Margaret sat across from Holden and read through every page. Then she read the last item. 18 months ago, Beckett had taken out a second mortgage on his home. He hadn't told Sienna the full amount. He hadn't told Margaret. And in a text message to a business associate, printed here, recovered through the legal inquiry Holden had quietly initiated, he had written 7 words that made Margaret's hands go still on the page. Once Mom's house sells, we'll be fine. She set the paper down. She looked out Holden's window at the grey Columbus sky, at the street below, at the ordinary people moving through their ordinary Tuesday morning, and she sat with the knowledge that her son had not stumbled into greed. He had been building toward it. He had been building toward it for years. While she paid for school trips she scraped together. While she sold things she loved to cover emergencies that turned out not to be emergencies. While she clipped coupons and drove her old Civic and kept quiet about the account in Portland because she needed to know, she needed to believe, that what he felt for her was real. He had known her house was worth something. He had been counting on it. She stood up slowly. She thanked Holden. She put on her coat. At the door, she stopped. "Now," she said, without turning around. "Now I'd like to change the will." Then came the thing that nearly broke what remained of Margaret's patience entirely. The competency filing arrived through Holden's office on a Wednesday, formal, legal, and deliberate. Beckett had retained an attorney. The filing cited Margaret's medical trauma, her age, and a pattern of financial behavior consistent with undue influence from a non-family party. Tessa. They were going after Tessa. Margaret set the phone down on the kitchen table and sat without moving. Button jumped into her lap. She placed her hand on him and breathed. Then she picked the phone back up. "What do we do?" she asked Holden. "We document everything," he said. "Every visit, every conversation, every independent decision. We build a record that makes this impossible to sustain." That evening, Tessa arrived and found Margaret at the kitchen table, not crying, not panicking. Just sitting with the papers in front of her and a look Tessa hadn't seen before. Tessa sat down. She read what was in front of her. Then she looked up. "He named me specifically." "Yes." Something moved through Tessa's expression, the specific feeling of being accused of something you know is false but cannot fully control. "I never asked you for a single thing." "I know. My license, my reputation at the hospital." "Holden is handling it," Margaret said firmly. "And I am not going to let this happen to you." She held Tessa's gaze. He picked the wrong target. Tessa was quiet for a moment. Then, before she could say another word, Margaret slid an envelope across the table toward her. Tessa looked at it. "What is this?" "Open it." Tessa opened it. She read the number on the check inside. Her face changed immediately, not with greed, not with calculation, but with something closer to alarm. "No," she said. "Tessa?" "No." She slid it back firmly. "I'm not taking this. It's a fraction of what you've—" "Margaret." Tessa's voice was quiet, but it had an edge to it that Margaret hadn't heard before. Not anger. Certainty. If helping people only matters when someone pays you afterward, then it wasn't help. She paused. "I came here because you needed someone. That's the whole reason. And the moment I take money for that, it becomes something else." Margaret looked at her for a long time. Then she took the envelope back without arguing. And she thought, that is exactly why. And then, slowly, in the way good things tend to arrive when you finally stop bracing for disaster, life began to feel like something worth living again. Tessa came on Tuesdays and Fridays. Wren came on the Fridays. Button had long since claimed permanent sovereignty over the armchair and showed no interest in negotiating the terms. Delaney came every morning she was able. She sat at the kitchen table and said exactly what she thought, which was, Margaret had come to understand, one of the rarest and most valuable things in the world. The Ellis Recovery Foundation took shape, in Holden's office, in late evening phone calls, in careful documents that Margaret read completely before signing anything. Recovery housing. Nursing scholarships. Transportation assistance. Medical advocacy for people who arrived at hospitals alone and stayed that way. She had lived that story. She intended to make it mean something. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, between the Tuesday visits and Wren's homework at the kitchen table and Delaney's casseroles and Button's absolute refusal to share anything, Margaret Lawson became, for the first time in longer than she could name, genuinely happy. Not performing it. Not managing toward it. Not substituting contentment for the real thing. Actually, quietly, completely happy. She slept through the night. She laughed at things without the laugh surprising her. She took Wren to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings and let Wren choose the flowers, which meant the kitchen was always full of whatever Wren found most interesting rather than what matched, which turned out to be exactly right. She called Delaney sometimes just to talk. Not about anything important. Just to hear a familiar voice and know someone would answer. She sat in the backyard on warm evenings with Button beside her and watched the light change through the forsythia, and thought about her husband, and smiled instead of aching. One Tuesday evening, Tessa arrived and stopped in the kitchen doorway. Margaret was singing, quietly, absently, to the radio while she made tea. She didn't notice Tessa for a moment. When she did, she laughed and said, "Don't tell anyone." Tessa leaned against the doorframe and smiled, the full, unguarded kind she rarely showed outside this house. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" Tessa thought about it. "Like yourself." Margaret considered that, really considered it, and found that it was true. She had spent decades being small, apologizing for her needs, needing less and calling it love. She had spent decades waiting for her son to see her. Now she had stopped waiting. And in the space where the waiting used to live, something else had grown. Something that felt, unmistakably, like a life that belonged to her. The cancer arrived 14 months after the accident. The kind that arrives quietly, growing somewhere private and patient, until one routine scan changes everything in a single sentence. For months from diagnosis to the end. Margaret heard the number and sat with it for a while before she told anyone. She sat in the oncologist's office and looked at the window and thought about all the things she had assumed she still had time for. Then, more slowly, she thought about all the things she had already done. The foundation was established. The documents were signed. The people who mattered knew they mattered. She had already said the things that needed saying. She went home. She called Tessa. She made tea. And then she made the most of what was left. Tessa reduced her hospital hours and moved into the guest room. Delaney came every day. Wren did homework at the kitchen table on weekday afternoons while Button supervised from the windowsill with his customary aristocratic contempt for everything that wasn't him. On her last clear afternoon, Margaret asked Tessa to open the window. The spring air came through, and she breathed it and looked at the forsythia blooming yellow against the back fence, the same fence it had bloomed against every April for 37 years, and said quietly, "I think I did okay." Tessa took her hand. "You did better than okay." "I wasted some years being small," Margaret said. "Apologizing for taking up space. Needing less and calling it strength." She paused. "But I think I made the last ones count." Tessa didn't argue. Didn't deflect. Didn't fill it with the gentle noise people offer when they don't know what else to give. "You did," she said. Simply. And meant it entirely. Margaret died 3 days later, at home, with the window open and Button at her feet and Tessa's hand in hers. The way she should have always been allowed to live. Surrounded by the people who stayed. The reading of the will was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in Holden Carter's office. Beckett arrived first. He wore a dark suit and an expression he had clearly rehearsed, something calibrated carefully between grief and appropriate dignity. Sienna was beside him in a charcoal coat, posture very straight, eyes moving around Holden's office with the quiet alertness of someone arriving somewhere they believe holds something for them. They had not seen Margaret in the final months. Beckett had called twice. He had said he wanted to visit. The timing had, apparently, continued to be impossible. Tessa arrived quietly with Wren, who had insisted on coming and could not be reasoned with on this point. Wren sat against the wall holding Button's carrier on her lap, which was not standard practice for a will reading, but which Holden Carter permitted without comment, because he was, fundamentally, a reasonable man. Delaney Price was there. A representative from the Ellis Foundation Board was there. 2 nurses from Mercy General, named in the scholarship fund, were there. Beckett noticed all of them, and something in his posture shifted, just slightly, while his face stayed controlled. Holden opened the folder. He read methodically. The Ellis Foundation, its charter, its funding, the Portland commercial properties forming its endowment, the investment accounts, the scholarship structure. As he read, the full scale of Margaret's estate emerged, number by number, line by line, into the quiet room. Beckett went very still. Sienna's breath changed almost imperceptibly beside him. Holden continued. The personal inheritance designated for Tessa Monroe. The amount. He read it clearly, without commentary, without pause. Sienna exhaled, sharp, involuntary. Beckett's jaw tightened in a way that looked like control but barely was. Then Holden reached the final section. To my son, Beckett Lawson, he read carefully, I leave a sum of $100,000. And a letter. The room was perfectly still. Beckett's face had gone pale. $100,000 against an estate of that scale was not an inheritance. It was a sentence. A verdict delivered in the only language that had ever fully reached him. Holden stood, walked to Beckett directly, and placed a sealed envelope in his hands. Beckett stared at it. She asked that you open it here, Holden said quietly. Beckett looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he opened it, slowly, as though something in him already understood he was not prepared for what was inside, and unfolded the pages. The room waited. He read. His expression moved through several things. Controlled disbelief first. Then something harder, the old strategy trying to reassert itself, trying to find the angle, the reframe, the argument. Then, somewhere in the middle pages, his face changed entirely. The strategy vanished. What replaced it was rawer, younger, and much, much worse. Sienna leaned toward him. Wren looked up from Button's carrier. Even Delaney Price, who had known something of the contents, went very still. Beckett's hand began to tremble. He kept reading. The letter said many things. It said she loved him if past tense, present tense, every tense, without condition. It said that love was not in question and had never been in question. What was in question was something else entirely, whether she could trust him with her life. Whether she could trust him with her choices. Whether she could trust him with the simple, fragile dignity of being allowed to age without being managed, minimized, and eventually erased. She could not. And then it said something else. Something nobody in that room had known was coming. It said that the secret she had kept for 11 years was not only about money. It was about his father. James Lawson had known about Raymond's estate before he died. He had been the one to ensure the inheritance structure was quietly arranged, so that Margaret would be fully protected if anything happened to him. He had known his own heart was failing months before the end. He had said nothing, because he knew Margaret would spend whatever energy she had left trying to save him, instead of grieving, and then continuing. He had protected her the only way he knew how. In silence. The same way she had protected everyone. And he had left a letter of his own, sealed, with Holden's predecessor, to be delivered to Beckett only at this specific moment. Only when Beckett was old enough to understand what it cost. Only when he had already lived long enough to see, clearly, what his choices had made of him. Holden walked to Beckett a second time and placed a smaller envelope on top of the pages already trembling in his hands. From your father, Holden said. Dated 24 years ago. Beckett stared at it. He opened it slowly. Inside were 3 pages, handwritten, his father's familiar slant, and Beckett read them the way a man reads something he can never unread. Near the bottom of the second page, he stopped. He read the same passage twice. Then he pressed his hand flat against his chest, like something had struck him there that he needed to hold in place, and for a long moment, he simply could not move. His father had written. Your mother will forgive you. She always does. That is the most extraordinary thing about her, and the thing I have always feared most. My fear, Beckett, the one that has kept me up more nights than I can count, is that one day you will become the kind of man who no longer deserves it. The room was absolutely silent. Then Holden reached into the folder one final time, and placed a small photograph on top of the letters in Beckett's hands. Beckett looked down at it. It was him. At 8 years old. Sitting on his mother's shoulders in the backyard of the house on Clover Lane, the house he had been pricing in his head, the house he had written 7 words about in a message he thought no one would ever find. He was laughing in the photograph. Both arms stretched wide. His mother's hands wrapped around his ankles to keep him steady, her face tilted up toward him, lit with the particular joy of a woman who could not imagine, in that moment, ever wanting anything more than exactly this. On the back of the photograph, in Margaret's handwriting, for words. I kept this because it reminded me who you were, before you became afraid. Whatever was left of Beckett's composure, the suit, the rehearsed expression, the careful posture of a man who had walked in expecting negotiation, came apart entirely. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. The way things fall apart in people who have spent a very long time holding themselves together with the wrong materials. He pressed both hands over his face. The letters. The photograph. His father's handwriting. His mother's. All of it crinkled softly against his palms. Sienna sat beside him without speaking, for once without a plan, without a calculation, without anything useful to offer. Wren, who was 9 years old and had not been briefed on the contents of anyone's letter, looked at Beckett Lawson's face, and quietly reached over and took Tessa's hand. After a long time, long enough that the room had stopped feeling like a professional space and had become something else entirely, Beckett lowered his hands. His eyes were red. His face had lost every last trace of its management. What was underneath was younger than the man who had walked in. Younger, and much less certain, and just barely beginning to understand what he had spent years dismantling. He looked across the room at Tessa Munro, directly, finally, with an expression that contained many things, and none of them comfortable. "She loved you," he said. His voice came out rough, scraped down to something real. "She actually loved you." Tessa looked back at him steadily. "I know. I didn't." He said it plainly, without defense, without strategy, without the contempt he had carried in his voice every time her name came up. "I thought it was the money. That you knew about it, that the whole thing was." He stopped. "I was wrong. I didn't know," Tessa said quietly. "I found out today. Same as you. She never told you. She never told me." Beckett looked down at the letters in his hands. His mother's handwriting. His father's. Two people who had spent their entire lives protecting everyone around them, quietly, without credit, without asking for anything back. And one 8-year-old boy in a photograph, arms stretched wide above the world, who had no idea yet what kind of man he was going to become. "She just wanted someone to be there," he said, barely above a whisper. That was all. That was the whole thing. Nobody answered. Because the answer had already happened. The person who showed up was sitting across the room. And the person who hadn't was holding the proof of it in his own shaking hands. Ellis House Recovery Center opened the following spring. The building sat on a street in Columbus with good morning light and a garden in the back that smelled, in the right season, like something alive and deliberate. The kind of garden someone plants because they genuinely believe in things growing. Tessa Munro became its director of patient care. She brought the same unhurried quality to every room, every intake, every person who arrived alone and frightened and unsure whether anyone was coming. At Ellis House, someone was always coming. Wren grew up helping on weekends and announced at 12 that she intended to be a doctor, which Tessa received with complete seriousness and zero surprise. Delaney Price came as often as her hip allowed. She brought food that wasn't strictly necessary. It was always exactly right. In the main hallway, beside the entrance, there was a photograph of Margaret Lawson, taken in the backyard of the house on Clover Lane on a warm April evening. She was sitting in the late sun with Button on her lap and an expression of such uncomplicated contentment that first-time visitors sometimes stopped and looked at it longer than they expected to. Beneath the photograph was a small engraved plate. It read, "She stayed small for too long. Then she decided to matter. Emmy Lawson." And beneath that, the Ellis House mission. For words only. Nobody recovers alone here. Beckett Lawson did not contest the will. Whether that was because Holden's documentation made the challenge impossible to sustain, or because his mother's letter had reached something in him that his posturing had spent years burying, or because his father's handwriting, 24 years old and utterly certain, had said the one thing no strategy could answer, no one could say for certain. He donated his inheritance to the Ellis Foundation the following year. A single note accompanied the transaction, sent to Holden Carter with no explanation attached. Holden passed it to Tessa. It contained one sentence. She told me love wasn't the same as trust. I'm trying to earn the second one back. I know it's too late for her. I'm doing it anyway. Tessa read it twice. Then she placed it in a desk drawer, beside Button's photograph and the ceramic frog Wren had rescued from the house on Clover Lane, because she said it needed to be somewhere that felt like the right place. Outside, the Ellis house garden moved gently in the wind. Inside, someone new had just arrived. 73 years old. Hip surgery. Family 2 states away and not answering calls. She came through the door the way people do when they have spent too long being told they were a burden, carefully, quietly, already apologizing for taking up space. Tessa Monroe walked through the door. She didn't rush. She didn't announce her presence with cheerful efficiency or rehearsed warmth. She simply walked in, sat beside the woman, and said, "You're safe here. Let me show you around." The woman looked at her. Her eyes filled, not with sadness, not with relief exactly, but with something that has no clean name. The feeling of arriving somewhere after a journey you didn't know you were taking. The feeling of a door opening into a room that was always warm, if only someone had told you it was there. She began to cry. Tessa took her hand and didn't let go. And in that moment, in that quiet hallway, in that building that smelled like fresh paint and morning coffee and something that felt, unmistakably, like a second chance, something was given back to a woman who had spent her whole life giving it away. The thing Margaret Lawson had wanted most in the world. The thing that had turned out to be worth more than millions. Someone had shown up.